Hey guys! Tonight we will see why it sucks to be poor in ancient Persia. Before that, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comment where you tuning from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Tonight, let us leave behind the grand palaces, golden treasures, and powerful kings of ancient Persia. Instead, we will walk quietly into the villages beyond the royal courts, where ordinary families woke before sunrise, worked beneath the hot sun, stretched their grain, carried water, and hoped that the next harvest would be kind. This is the story of what it could mean to live without wealth in the vast Persian Empire. So settle in, let the day become quiet, and travel slowly back through the centuries to a small home beneath the ancient Persian sky. The house at the edge of the village. Waking before the sun. Long before the sun appeared above the distant hills, the village was still. The darkness rested gently over the roofs, the fields, and the narrow paths between the houses. The night air was cool, and for a few precious moments, almost nothing moved. Above the village, the stars remained bright. They had watched over the settlement for thousands of nights, long before anyone living there had been born, and they would continue to shine long after the people below had disappeared. But inside one small house, the day was already beginning. There was no clock to announce the hour. No bell. No servant waiting beside the bed. For a poor family in the Persian countryside, the morning was often measured by the sky itself. When the darkness began to soften, it was time to rise. The house was modest, built largely from earth and mud brick. Such homes were practical and common across many parts of the ancient Near East. The thick walls could offer protection from the heat, while the simple construction could be repaired using materials available nearby. But a simple home required constant attention. A wall could crack. A roof could weaken. A wooden beam could need replacing. A doorway could become damaged. For a wealthy household, repairs could be arranged. For a poor family, repairs were another task to be added to an already endless list. Inside, the family slept close together. The floor was covered with simple woven materials and whatever bedding the household could afford. There were no mattresses like those found in wealthy modern homes, no electric lights, and no comfortable rooms designed exclusively for sleeping. The darkness was broken only by the faint remains of yesterday's fire. Madux opened her eyes. For a moment, she did not move. She listened. Outside, somewhere beyond the wall, an animal shifted. A goat gave a quiet sound. Then came the distant call of another household beginning its morning. Madux slowly sat up. The first thing she thought about was food. Not because she was unusually hungry, but because food was something that had to be planned. Every day. Every meal. Every handful of grain mattered. She reached toward the small area where the household's cooking supplies were kept. There was grain. Not much, but enough for the morning. She carefully measured what was needed. The movements were familiar. She had performed them countless times. There was something almost peaceful about the routine. Scoop. Measure. Pour. Grind. Prepare. The work was repetitive, but repetition was part of survival. Outside, the eastern sky was slowly becoming lighter. Her husband, Artavardiya, was beginning to wake. He had work waiting for him. There was always work waiting for him. If the family depended on agriculture, the rhythm of life was closely tied to the land. Fields did not care whether a person was tired. Seed still needed to be planted. Water still needed to reach crops. Animals still needed feeding. Harvests still needed gathering. and tools still needed repairing. The earth could be generous, but it demanded patience and labor in return. Artavardiya sat quietly. For a moment, he looked toward the doorway. Beyond it lay another day. He did not know exactly what the day would bring. Perhaps the weather would remain favorable. Perhaps the irrigation channels would carry enough water. Perhaps a tool would break. Perhaps an animal would become sick. Perhaps an official would arrive with some obligation to be fulfilled. Perhaps nothing unusual would happen at all. And in some ways, that was what a poor person hoped for most. Nothing unusual. A quiet day was a good day. A day without illness. Without injury. Without a broken tool. Without an unexpected expense. Without an empty storage jar. Without bad news. The family prepared a simple meal. Bread was central to the lives of many ancient communities, and grain was one of the most important foundations of survival. For ordinary people, food was rarely about variety. It was about reliability. Could the household produce enough grain? Could enough be stored? Would the harvest last until the next one? Could some seed grain be protected for planting? These questions were more important than whether dinner tasted interesting. Madukst prepared what the household had. The children were beginning to wake. The youngest remained wrapped in a simple covering, reluctant to leave the warmth. The older children knew better. Morning meant responsibilities. They would eventually need to help with animals, household work, gathering fuel, carrying water, or assisting in the fields. Children in ancient societies did not necessarily spend their early years completely separated from adult work. Instead, skills were gradually learned by watching. A child watched a mother prepare grain. A father repair a tool. An older sibling tend an animal. A neighbor work with cloth. An elder explain the behavior of the weather. Knowledge traveled through ordinary moments. There were no printed manuals sitting on a shelf. No schoolbook explaining how to survive the coming harvest. Most knowledge was carried by people. And much of it was learned through repetition. Madukst handed food to the children. They ate quietly. There was no grand breakfast. No abundance. But there was warmth. And there was family. This is important when imagining poverty in the ancient world. Poverty did not mean that every moment was miserable. People still laughed. They still loved. They still told stories. They still celebrated weddings and festivals. They still became attached to animals. They still watched children grow. A poor household could contain affection, humor, pride, and hope. The difficulty was that these things existed alongside constant material uncertainty. A wealthy person could often survive a bad month. A poor family might struggle to survive a bad season. That difference shaped everything. After the meal, Artavardiya prepared to leave. His clothing was practical. A poor laborer did not need elaborate garments designed to display status. Clothing had to survive work. It had to withstand dust, sun, movement, and repeated use. A garment that could be repaired was valuable. A garment that could be passed from one family member to another was even more valuable. Nothing useful was casually discarded. The same was true of tools. A broken tool was not simply rubbish. It was a problem. If a tool could be repaired, it was repaired. If a handle could be replaced, it was replaced. If an object could be reused for another purpose, someone would find that purpose. This careful relationship with objects was not necessarily a philosophy. It was simply practical. When you possessed little, what you owned mattered. Artavardiya stepped outside. The cool air touched his face. The village was no longer silent. Other families were emerging. Some were walking toward fields. Others were preparing animals. Smoke rose slowly from cooking fires. A dog wandered along the edge of the settlement. Somewhere in the distance, a donkey called. The first sunlight appeared on the highest parts of the landscape. And slowly, the ancient Persian countryside began to wake. Artavardia looked toward the fields. They were waiting. The work ahead would be tiring. It would be dusty. It would take hours. But he walked toward it anyway. Because for people living close to the edge of survival, work was not simply something that occupied the day. Work was what protected tomorrow. And so, while the wealthy world of Persian kings continued its distant life of palaces, officials, ceremonies, gardens, and magnificent stone monuments, another Persia was waking at the same moment. A quieter Persia. A Persia of farmers and herders. Of potters and laborious. Of women preparing grain. Of children learning household tasks. Of people whose names were rarely written into royal inscriptions. Their lives were not usually carved into enormous monuments. But they were essential. They planted the fields, raised animals, made textiles, prepared food, maintained homes, carried water, built and repaired things. And somehow, day after day, they kept their households going. The sun continued to rise. The shadows grew shorter. And the first ordinary day of our story had begun. A day that belongs to work. By the time the sun had climbed above the horizon, the quiet softness of dawn had disappeared. The village was fully awake now. Smoke drifted upward from household fires. Animals moved restlessly in their enclosures. Voices carried along the narrow paths between the houses, sometimes only a few words, sometimes a brief greeting between neighbors who had already known one another for years. Beyond the houses, the field stretched toward the horizon. This was where much of ordinary life was decided. For families who depended upon agriculture, the land could determine whether the coming year would be comfortable, difficult, or frightening. A good harvest could fill storage jars, provide seed for the following season, support animals, and leave enough produce to meet obligations. A poor harvest could do the opposite. And so Artavardia walked toward the fields with the quiet seriousness of someone who understood that every morning mattered. He was not thinking about the Persian king. He was not thinking about distant palaces. He was not thinking about the enormous size of the empire. His world, at that moment, was much smaller. It was the field in front of him, the tool in his hand, the soil beneath his feet, and the work that needed to be finished before the heat became unbearable. He joined other laborious. Some were members of their own households. Others may have been working for landowners or larger agricultural households. Ancient Persian society was not made up only of kings and nobles. It contained farmers, artisans, laborious, herders, servants, soldiers, administrators, and many other people whose economic circumstances could be very different. And within the broad category of poor, there were many different lives. Some families owned a small plot. Some worked land belonging to someone else. Some combined farming with herding. Some relied on crafts. Some worked for wages or rations. Some had family networks that could help during difficult years. Others had fewer options. Poverty was not a single experience. But one thing many poorer households shared was the importance of labor. If you had little wealth, your ability to work was itself a form of security. Your hands were valuable. Your strength was valuable. Your time was valuable. And that made illness especially frightening. Artavardiya began working. The first hours were often the most pleasant. The air was still relatively cool. The soil was easier to work before the full heat of the day. The countryside had a calm beauty. Birds moved across the sky. The smell of earth rose from the fields. In the distance, other workers moved slowly through the landscape. For someone watching from far away, the scene might have looked peaceful. And it was peaceful. But peace did not mean ease. Work could still be exhausting. A person could enjoy the quiet of a field while feeling every ache in their shoulders. The ancient world demanded enormous amounts of physical effort from people who possessed very little mechanical assistance. There were animals to guide, loads to carry, ground to prepare, crops to tend, water to move, tools to maintain, harvests to gather. And after the agricultural work ended, household work still remained. This was particularly true for women. While Artavardiya worked outside, Madukst had not suddenly gained a free morning. Her own work had simply begun elsewhere. The household needed water. Water was one of the quiet foundations of everyday life. A family could not cook without it. They could not easily clean without it. Animals needed it. People needed it. And depending on the location, obtaining water could require considerable effort. Madukst prepared the children and began the tasks of the household. Some children were old enough to help. An older child might carry a smaller container. Another might watch animals. Someone might gather fuel. Someone else might help with food preparation. The family worked as a unit. This did not mean every household divided tasks in exactly the same way. Life differed from region to region. But in a poor household, there was little room for wasted labor. If one person became unavailable, another often had to take over. This was one of the hidden difficulties of poverty. A wealthy household might possess servants who could absorb extra work. A poor household usually absorbed it within the family. If a child became sick, the mother might have more work. If the father was injured, the family might lose an important source of labor. If a woman became ill, household production could suffer immediately. Everything was connected. The household was a small economic system. And every person inside it mattered. By late morning, the sun had become stronger. Artavardiya wiped sweat from his face. The field seemed to stretch endlessly. He paused briefly. Around him, other workers were doing the same. Nobody had truly stopped. They were simply conserving energy. The rhythm of agricultural labor was rarely one continuous burst of effort. It was a pattern. Work. Pause. Work again. Drink when water was available. Move slowly. Continue. The sun climbed higher. The shadows became smaller. And the peaceful morning became hot. This was another reality of life for people whose work took place outdoors. Weather was not simply something to discuss. Weather affected survival. Too much rain could damage crops. Too little rain could do the same. Heat could exhaust workers and animals. Cold could damage crops or make certain tasks more difficult. The farmer had to accept that much of life remained beyond his control. He could prepare the soil. He could plant carefully. He could tend his crops. He could maintain irrigation. He could watch the sky. But he could not command the clouds. That uncertainty followed poor families throughout the year. For a wealthy household, a bad harvest could be an inconvenience. For a poor household, it could become a crisis. Back at home, Madukst continued working. She prepared food for later. She checked the grain. She cared for the younger children. She dealt with household items that needed repair. Perhaps there was cloth to mend. Perhaps wool needed attention. Perhaps food needed grinding. Perhaps an animal needed care. The work was not dramatic. That was precisely the point. Much of ancient life was made up of ordinary tasks that had to be repeated every day. Grinding grain, sweeping the floor, preparing food, carrying water, repairing clothing, cleaning cooking vessels, tending children, feeding animals. None of these activities would become famous. Yet without them, the household could not continue. And when we imagine ancient Persia today, it is easy to picture only the grandest things. The royal road, the palaces, the carved reliefs, the soldiers, the ceremonies, the magnificent architecture. But underneath that impressive world was another world. A world made possible by ordinary labor. Someone had to grow the grain. Someone had to transport it. Someone had to prepare it. Someone had to make the clothing. Someone had to build the houses. Someone had to care for the animals. Someone had to maintain the fields. Someone had to raise children who would eventually do the same work. The empire depended on countless people whose daily lives rarely appeared in royal art. And among them were the poor. At midday, Artavardia finally returned briefly to the household. The children were already eating. The meal was simple. There was no reason to waste food. A household that had little could not afford careless portions. Artavardia sat quietly. For a short time, the family was together. The conversation was ordinary. Someone mentioned the weather. Someone mentioned an animal. Someone asked about the field. The youngest child wanted something. Madakst answered. There was no grand discussion. No speech about poverty. No dramatic realization that they were living difficult lives. This was simply their normal. And perhaps that is one of the strangest things about poverty. People adapt. What seems unbearable from a distance can become routine when it is lived every day. A person learns which grain lasts longest, which tools are worth repairing, which neighbor might lend a hand, which path is shortest, which animal is reliable, which season is dangerous, which foods can be stored, which expenses can wait, and which ones cannot. This knowledge is a kind of wealth. It cannot be counted in silver. It cannot be displayed in a palace. But it can keep a household alive. After the meal, Artavardia returned to work. The afternoon stretched ahead. The heat became heavier. The work continued. And eventually, the sun began its slow descent. Shadows returned to the fields. The day was becoming cooler. But the work was not necessarily finished. There were tools to put away, animals to check, things to carry home. The journey back to the village was slow. Artavardia walked beneath the evening sky. The landscape was beginning to change color. The harsh brightness of midday softened into warmer light. For a moment, the countryside looked almost beautiful enough to forget how hard the day had been. He could hear distant voices. Children were returning from small tasks. Animals were being guided toward their enclosures. Cooking fires were being prepared. The village was entering another familiar stage of its daily rhythm. Night. Soon, Madakst would prepare another modest meal. The children would settle down. The fire would become smaller. And tomorrow would arrive. That was perhaps the hardest part. Not that one day was difficult, but that another day was always waiting. Bread, grain, and the empty storage jar. What poor people actually ate. Night had passed quietly over the village. The stars had faded. The darkness had lifted. And once again, the first pale light of morning began spreading across the Persian countryside. Inside the small mud brick house, Madukst was already awake. Before anyone spoke, before the children began moving beneath their coverings, she thought about the same question she had thought about yesterday. Food. There was nothing unusual about this. For a poor household, food was not something that could simply be taken for granted. It was something to measure, something to preserve, something to plan, something to stretch. The household's food supply was tied closely to the seasons. When the harvest was plentiful, there was more grain to store. When the harvest was poor, every handful became more important. And between those two moments stretched an entire year. Madukst moved toward the storage area of the house. The household's grain was among its most important possessions. Grain was not simply an ingredient. It was security. It represented bread for the family, seed for the next planting, food that could potentially be exchanged, and, when necessary, something that could help satisfy obligations. A storage jar that was full could make a family feel safe. A storage jar that was becoming empty could make even a quiet household uneasy. She looked inside. There was still grain. Not an abundance, but enough. For now. She took what was needed and began preparing it. The work of transforming grain into food was itself labor. The grain had to be processed. It had to be ground. It had to be prepared. And eventually, it would become bread or another simple dish. For modern people, bread can seem like something ordinary and effortless. You walk into a shop. You choose a loaf. You bring it home. But in an ancient household, bread represented an entire chain of work. Someone had grown the grain. Someone had harvested it. Someone had separated it from unwanted material. Someone had stored it. Someone had ground it. Someone had prepared the dough. Someone had cooked it. The final piece of bread was the end of many hours of human effort. For poor families, that effort was especially visible. The household did not have endless supplies, so the ingredients available locally mattered. Barley was important in many parts of the ancient Near East. Wheat was also valuable. Different regions of the Persian Empire had different climates, soils, crops, and food traditions, so there was never one single Persian diet. The empire stretched across an enormous area. From the Iranian plateau to Mesopotamia, from Central Asian regions to parts of Anatolia and Egypt, people ate what their environments and circumstances allowed. This meant that an ordinary meal in one part of the empire could look very different from one somewhere else. But among poorer people, simplicity was often the common feature. Grain formed the foundation. Alongside it could come legumes, onions, herbs, fruits, dates, dairy products, and other locally available foods. Some families might keep chickens or goats where the environment allowed. Others might rely more heavily on farming. Some might fish. Some might herd animals. Some might exchange labor or goods for food. There was no supermarket waiting around the corner. If you wanted something to eat, it generally had to come from your household, your neighbors, your local market, your employer, or the surrounding land. And that made the seasons extremely important. In the warmer months, some foods were easier to obtain. Fresh fruits and vegetables could appear when their seasons arrived. Milk could be available from animals. Herbs could be gathered. But preservation mattered because nature did not provide the same things all year. Drying was useful. Salting was useful. Storage was essential. A family that understood how to preserve food had a better chance of making supplies last. And yet, even good preparation had limits. A poor household could only store what it had managed to acquire. Madux finished preparing the morning meal. It was simple. That word is worth remembering. Simple did not necessarily mean unpleasant. A warm piece of bread could be comforting. A bowl of grain cooked with whatever vegetables or legumes were available could fill the stomach. Dates could provide sweetness. Onions could add flavor. Herbs could make plain food more enjoyable. Food did not have to be luxurious to be meaningful. For a hungry child, a warm meal was enough. The children gathered around. The youngest reached toward the food. Madux divided it carefully. She had learned the mathematics of a poor kitchen. If there were 5 people and enough food for 4 generous portions, everyone could not eat generously. The portions had to be adjusted. A little less now might mean enough later. This was not always dramatic. Often it was simply habit. A mother might eat less so her children could eat more. An older child might understand that the youngest should receive a little extra. A family might save part of the meal for someone still working outside. These quiet decisions rarely appear in historical records. Yet they were part of everyday survival. The wealthy could display food. The poor had to calculate it. In elite Persian environments, feasts could involve numerous dishes, valuable ingredients, wine, animals, fruits, and carefully arranged meals. Royal and aristocratic households had access to resources far beyond those available to an ordinary agricultural family. But the contrast should not make us imagine that poor people never tasted anything enjoyable. They did. People have always found ways to make simple food satisfying. A little oil could change a dish. Herbs could add fragrance. Fruit could provide sweetness. Fresh bread could transform a modest meal. A shared meal could become a social moment. Food was not only about calories. It was part of family life. Part of hospitality. Part of festivals. Part of religious and cultural traditions. Even a poor household could take pride in preparing food well. A family might have little wealth and still know exactly how to make the best meal possible from what was available. That knowledge was valuable. But there was always a shadow behind it. The storage jar. The jar represented tomorrow. Today there was food. Tomorrow there would need to be food again. And the day after that. And the day after that. The family could not eat all its grain simply because they were hungry today. Some had to remain. Some might need to be saved for seed. Some might need to last until the next harvest. This required restraint. Imagine standing in front of your household's grain supply. You are hungry. Your children are hungry. There is food in front of you. But you know that if you use too much today, you may have less next month. There is no certainty that the next harvest will be generous. There is no guarantee that the weather will cooperate. There is no guarantee that an animal will not become sick. There is no guarantee that an unexpected obligation will not arise. So you measure. You calculate. You save. This is what poverty often does. It turns ordinary objects into things filled with meaning. A jar is no longer just a jar. It becomes a promise. Or a warning. A goat is not merely an animal. It is milk. It is offspring. It is wool or hide. It is something that might be exchanged. A bundle of grain is not merely food. It is tomorrow's meal. A tool is not simply wood and metal. It is the ability to work. A strong pair of hands is not merely part of a person. It is the household's labor. Everything becomes connected. After breakfast, Madux cleaned the cooking area. The children moved outside. The day was becoming warmer. The village had returned to its familiar rhythm. People carried out their tasks. Animals were tended. Workers moved toward the fields. And the smell of bread and cooking fires gradually disappeared into the morning air. For a moment, everything seemed normal. And it was normal. But poverty was often hidden inside normality. Nobody needed to announce that they were poor. The condition was visible in small details. The number of animals they owned. The quality of their clothing. The size of their house. The tools they possessed. The amount of stored grain. The amount of land they could work. The food they could afford. The opportunities available to their children. None of these things alone told the whole story. Together, they shaped a person's life. And so the family continued through another morning. They had eaten. They had enough for today. The storage jar still contained grain. For now, there was no crisis. That was enough. In a poor household, sometimes the absence of disaster was itself a kind of blessing. The sun climbed higher. The fields waited. The children played for a little while before being called to help. Madux returned to her work. Artavardir continued his labor. And somewhere inside the quiet house, the grain remained. Waiting. Because the real question was never only whether there was food today. The real question was whether there would still be food tomorrow. When the harvest was bad, the Persian countryside could look peaceful beneath the morning sun. Fields moved gently in the breeze. Dust rose softly beneath the feet of passing animals. Farmers worked beneath the open sky. From a distance, it might have seemed that the land offered everything a family needed. Grain grew from the soil. Trees provided fruit. Animals grazed nearby. Water flowed through channels in places where irrigation had been carefully maintained. But a farmer knew something that a traveler might not. The land could give, and the land could take away. A harvest was never completely guaranteed. A family could work hard and still face a poor season. The reasons could be many. Too little rain. Too much rain. Extreme heat. Cold arriving at the wrong time. Pests. Plant disease. Problems with irrigation. Animals becoming sick. Or simply a harvest that turned out smaller than expected. For a wealthy household, a disappointing harvest could be painful. For a poor household, it could threaten the entire year. And this was why the storage jar inside the house mattered so much. It was not merely a container. It was the boundary between having enough and not having enough. Imagine a family after a difficult harvest. The fields have been worked. The grain has been gathered. The household has done what it can. But when the harvest is finally measured, the result is disappointing. There is less grain than expected. Perhaps much less. The family looks at what has been collected. There is enough to feel relieved for a moment. But then the calculations begin. How much must be kept for food? How much must be preserved as seed? How much might be needed for animals? What obligations still need to be met? How many months remain until the next harvest? These questions can make a quiet household very serious. A family could not simply eat everything immediately. The next planting season still had to be considered. Seed was precious. Without seed, there would be no crop. Without the crop, there would be no harvest. And without the harvest, there would be very little to carry the household forward. So the family had to make difficult choices. The grain was divided. Some was kept for eating. Some for planting. Some might be used for other obligations. The remaining amount was placed into storage. Then the family waited. At first, nothing seemed different. The morning meal was still prepared. The children still woke. Artavardiya still went to work. Madukst still carried out the household tasks. But gradually, the shortage began to appear in small ways. Bread became smaller. Meals became simpler. Food that might once have been eaten freely was used more carefully. Perhaps a little less grain was ground. Perhaps a vegetable was added to stretch the meal. Perhaps a pot of grain was cooked with legumes so that the meal could feed more people. Perhaps the family began relying more heavily on whatever local foods were available. This is how hunger could approach. Not always dramatically. Sometimes slowly. One smaller portion. Then another. One meal with less variety. Then another. A storage jar that seemed comfortably full after harvest began to show a little more empty space. Nobody wanted to look at that empty space for too long. But everyone noticed it. The children noticed first through their stomachs. They might not understand the economics of grain. They simply knew that they were hungry. A mother might respond by giving them something else. A little bread. A date. A portion saved from another meal. Anything available. Madukst would not explain the household's entire situation to a small child. She would simply say that food was coming. And perhaps it was. But perhaps it was not. This uncertainty could be one of the hardest parts of living close to the edge. The family could work hard and still not know what the next month would bring. In a farming society, the future was always partly hidden. You planted seeds into soil and waited. You watered them and waited. You watched the sky and waited. You watched the crops grow. You hoped. There was patience in farming. But there was also anxiety. The ancient Persian world included sophisticated agricultural practices and systems of irrigation in various regions. Water management could make cultivation possible in environments where rainfall alone was insufficient. Yet even careful management had limits. A farmer could maintain a channel. He could clear a blocked passage. He could guide water where it was needed. But he could not make a drought disappear. He could not force the clouds to rain. He could not guarantee that every seed would become a healthy plant. And so poor families lived with a strange combination of control and helplessness. They controlled their labor. But they did not control nature. They controlled how carefully they used food. But they did not control the size of the harvest. They could repair tools. But they could not prevent every tool from breaking. They could save. But they could not save endlessly if there was never enough to begin with. This was why being poor was not simply a matter of having fewer beautiful things. It was about having less protection from bad luck. A wealthy person possessed reserves. A poor person often possessed very little distance between ordinary life and crisis. That distance could be measured in grain. Sometimes in animals. Sometimes in clothing. Sometimes in the health of a family member. If Artavardiya became sick during a difficult season, the problem was not only that he would feel unwell. His labor might stop. If his labor stopped, less work could be completed. If less work was completed, less could be produced. If less was produced, the family might have fewer resources. One event could lead to another. Poverty could become a chain. And yet, people were not helpless. Communities mattered. Neighbors mattered. Relatives mattered. A family might receive assistance from others. People could exchange goods. They could share labor. They could borrow. They could participate in local networks of support. Ancient communities were not made entirely of isolated households. People depended on one another. A neighbor might help repair a wall. A relative might provide food. Someone might lend an animal. Another person might help with a harvest. These relationships could make the difference between surviving a difficult period and falling deeper into hardship. But help had limits. Everyone had their own household to support. If an entire region experienced difficulty, there might be little surplus to share. And that was when a bad harvest could become much more serious. Imagine several households opening their storage jars at the same time. All of them finding less grain than they wanted. All of them becoming more careful. All of them reducing consumption. The village would still look the same from the outside. The houses would still stand. The paths would still be there. The animals would still move through the settlement. But inside the homes, people would be counting. How much remains? How long will it last? What can we eat instead? When will the next harvest come? This quiet arithmetic was part of the ancient experience of poverty. It was not written on monuments. It did not appear in royal ceremonies. But it shaped ordinary life. As the months passed, the family adapted. Madux became even more careful with grain. Nothing was wasted. Crumbs mattered. Food scraps might be given to animals. Containers were checked. Supplies were counted. The children learned that there were foods they could not simply take whenever they wanted. They learned restraint. Not because someone had given them a philosophical lesson, but because the household required it. Artavardir continued working. His body grew tired. Yet he knew that stopping for too long was dangerous. The field did not wait. The next crop had to be prepared. There was always another season coming. That was one of the peculiar rhythms of agricultural life. A poor harvest did not mean there was less work. Sometimes it meant there was more. More careful planning. More labor. More searching. More repairing. More concern. The family moved through the difficult season together. And eventually, slowly, the storage jar became lighter. Not empty. Not yet. But lighter. The bottom could now be seen more clearly. Madux looked at it one evening after preparing the family's meal. She stood quietly for a moment. The children were nearby. Artavardir had returned from the fields. Outside, the evening breeze was moving through the village. The world looked peaceful. And it was peaceful. But inside the house, the family understood something. The next harvest could not come soon enough. They would need rain. They would need healthy crops. They would need their animals to remain well. They would need their tools to survive. They would need their bodies to remain strong. They would need luck. And perhaps most of all, they would need enough grain to make it through the waiting. Madux closed the storage jar. The sound was soft, almost insignificant. But for the household, it marked another day of survival. Outside, darkness slowly settled over the Persian countryside. The first stars appeared. The children became sleepy. The fire burned lower. And the family prepared to rest. Tomorrow would bring another day of work. Another day of measuring. Another day of waiting. For now, there was still food. And sometimes, when you lived close to the edge, that was enough reason to be grateful. The village grew quiet. The fields disappeared into darkness. The storage jar rested inside the little house. The life of endless labor. Working the Persian countryside. Morning returned gently to the village. The darkness lifted from the fields, and the first light spread across the distant hills. A thin layer of coolness still rested over the earth, making the early hours more comfortable than the heat that would eventually arrive. Atavardiya was already awake. He had slept deeply enough to recover some of his strength, but not long enough to forget the work waiting outside. For a poor farming family, there was rarely a moment when the work was truly finished. Yesterday's work became today's responsibility. Today's work would create tomorrow's responsibility. The seasons moved forward whether the family was ready or not. So Atavardiya stepped outside. The village was beginning to stir. A few people were already walking toward their fields. Others were preparing animals. A woman carried a container toward a water source. Somewhere nearby, a child was being called back into a house. The sounds were quiet. Familiar. Almost comforting. This was the sound of ordinary life. Atavardiya walked toward the fields with his tools. There was nothing impressive about what he carried. Simple agricultural tools were valuable precisely because they allowed a person to turn physical effort into food. A farmer could own very little and still understand the importance of every tool. A damaged handle could slow the work. A broken implement could create another problem. A lost tool could mean finding a replacement or borrowing one from somebody else. For a wealthy household, replacing equipment could be easier. For a poor farmer, even a small problem could be inconvenient. So tools were treated carefully. They were repaired, maintained, used until they could no longer be used. The field ahead of Atavardiya was quiet. The soil looked ordinary, but to him it represented the future. Every season began with preparation. The ground needed attention. Seeds needed to be planted at the appropriate time. Crops needed care. Water had to reach them where irrigation was necessary. Weeds and other problems had to be dealt with. And eventually, everything had to be harvested. Agriculture was not one task. It was a long chain of tasks. If one part went badly, the effects could continue through the entire season. Atavardiya began working. The first movement was easy. Then another. Then another. Soon his shoulders began to warm. The coolness of morning slowly disappeared. The sun climbed higher. Around him, other workers continued their own tasks. There was no single schedule that applied identically to every Persian farmer. The empire was enormous. Its lands contained mountains, plains, dry regions, fertile valleys, river systems, and different climates. People adapted their agricultural lives to the environment around them. But wherever farming was important, physical labor remained essential. Machines did not perform the work for them. Animals could help with some tasks. Water systems could help move water. Tools could make work more efficient. But human hands remained at the center of daily production. This meant that strength mattered. Endurance mattered. Experience mattered. And health mattered enormously. Atavardiya knew this. His body was part of the household's wealth. Not wealth in the form of silver or gold. Something much more immediate. If he could work, the household could produce. If he could not work, the household had a problem. This was why illness could be frightening. So could injury. A cut that became infected. a broken bone, a damaged back, a serious fever. Any of these could interfere with a family's ability to survive. The poor did not necessarily live every moment expecting disaster. People cannot live that way. Instead, they learn to continue. They learn to accept aches. They learn to work through tiredness. They learned which pains were temporary and which required rest. Sometimes they had no choice but to continue. The field did not care about yesterday's exhaustion. The crop did not understand that someone had slept badly. The animals still needed care. The household still needed food. Artavardiya paused briefly. He looked toward the horizon. The morning was beautiful. The sunlight touched the landscape. A few birds moved across the sky. The fields were calm. For a moment, there was no need to think about anything beyond the present. Then he returned to work. Back at the house, Madukst was working too. It is easy to imagine that the agricultural labor belonged mostly to men. But the economic life of a poor household was much more complicated. Women performed essential work. They prepared food, processed grain, made and repaired clothing, cared for children, managed household supplies, collected materials, tended animals in many households, and, depending on circumstances, contributed directly to agricultural production and other forms of economic activity. The household depended on everyone's effort. This was particularly true when the family possessed little surplus. There was no large staff of servants to divide the work. If something needed doing, someone in the family had to do it. Madukst moved between tasks. She prepared food, then checked on the children, then dealt with another household task, then returned to food preparation. The work had no dramatic beginning. There was simply always something next. This was one of the great differences between poverty and wealth. It was not only about possessions. It was about how much labor was required to maintain ordinary life. A wealthy household could have people whose job was specifically to prepare food. Another person might care for animals. Another might clean. Another might manage clothing. Another might organize supplies. A poor household could have one woman doing several of these things, and often while caring for children at the same time. The labor of poor people was therefore not limited to the hours spent in a field. It continued inside the home. It followed them into the evening. Sometimes it continued even after the fire had been reduced to glowing embers. The children also gradually became part of the household's work. A very young child might have little responsibility. But as children grew, they could learn tasks suited to their age. They might help with animals, carry small objects, gather fuel, assist with household preparation, watch younger children, learn how tools were used, observe how food was prepared. Eventually, they would be expected to contribute more. This was not necessarily understood as cruel by the people living within that society. It was simply part of life. Children learned by participation. The skills they acquired were the skills that allowed households and communities to continue. A child who learned how to tend an animal gained something valuable. A child who learned to prepare grain gained something valuable. A child who understood farming gained knowledge that could support an entire future household. Education existed in different forms. Not every form of knowledge came from a formal school. For ordinary people, practical knowledge could be more important than anything written on a tablet. How to recognize good soil. How to care for an animal. How to preserve food. How to repair a wall. How to work a field. How to weave. How to cook. How to store grain. How to judge weather. These skills were passed from one generation to another, and they were learned slowly. Through watching. Through copying. Through mistakes. Through repetition. Artavardiya had learned many of his own skills this way. He remembered watching older members of his family when he was young. At the time, the movements had seemed ordinary. Now he understood that they represented years of knowledge. The work continued. The sun became hotter. The earth became dry beneath his feet. He drank when water was available, then returned to the field. By midday, his body felt heavy. His shoulders ached. His hands were tired. But the day was not finished. This was the quiet cruelty of agricultural labor. The hardest part was often not the individual task. It was repetition. The same movement. Again. And again. And again. One day. Then another. Then another. The rhythm could be almost meditative. A person could work for hours without saying much. The body learned the movement. The mind wandered. Perhaps Artavardiya thought about his children. Perhaps he thought about the grain stored at home. Perhaps he wondered whether the coming season would be better. Perhaps he thought about nothing at all. There can be a strange peace in repetitive work. The sound of tools against soil. The movement of animals. The wind passing over the fields. The warmth of the sun. The slow rhythm of breathing. For a modern listener, it might sound almost soothing. But for the person doing the work, the same rhythm could be exhausting. Both things could be true at once. The countryside could be beautiful. The work could still be hard. The day continued. Eventually, the shadows began to lengthen. The sun moved lower. Artavardiya and the other workers slowly finished their tasks. There was still work waiting at home. Animals needed attention. Tools needed to be put away. Food needed to be prepared. Children needed care. The evening meal would need to be made. And tomorrow would bring another list. That was the life of the poor agricultural household. Not one enormous hardship, but hundreds of small responsibilities repeated over years. Work became the structure around which everything else was built. It provided food. It protected the household. It maintained the animals. It supported the family. And yet it also consumed time. When your body was your wealth. The evening had settled gently over the village. The day's heat was beginning to disappear from the earth, and the coolness of night was slowly returning. Inside the small house, the family had finished eating. There had not been much food, but there had been enough. For a little while, nobody needed to think about tomorrow. The children were becoming sleepy. Madukst was tidying the cooking area. Artavardiya sat quietly near the fading warmth of the fire. His body was tired. His shoulders ached from the day's labor. His hands were rough. His feet were sore. He had worked for many hours, and yet none of this seemed unusual. This was simply what his body was expected to do. For a poor person in the ancient world, the body could be one of the most important possessions they had. A wealthy household could possess land, animals, precious objects, servants, stored food, and silver. A poor laborer might possess very little of these things. But they still possessed their ability to work, their strength, their experience, their hands, their endurance, their health. In a world without modern machines, this mattered enormously. If a person could work, they could contribute. If they could contribute, the household had a better chance of producing food and maintaining itself. But if the body failed, even temporarily, the consequences could be serious. This was one of the quiet dangers of poverty. A rich person could sometimes survive an interruption. A poor person might have almost no cushion. Imagine waking one morning with a fever. You feel weak. Your head aches. Your body wants to remain beneath the blanket. But the animals still need feeding. The household still needs food. The field still needs attention. There may be no comfortable option to simply stop working for several days. Of course, people did become sick. They rested when they could. Families cared for one another. Traditional knowledge about plants, food, hygiene, and healing existed. Specialists and physicians also existed in the ancient world. But medical care was not modern medicine. There were no antibiotics. No modern hospitals. No reliable treatment for every infection. And even where healing knowledge was sophisticated, poor families did not necessarily have equal access to every resource. So illness could be frightening. An ordinary injury could become more serious. A wound could interfere with work. A painful joint could make farming difficult. A serious illness could prevent someone from earning or producing. And the household would have to adjust. This was why people paid attention to their bodies. A farmer knew his own strength. He knew when the heat was becoming dangerous. He knew when he could continue and when he needed to pause. He understood that exhaustion could lead to mistakes. A tired person could damage a tool. An exhausted worker could fall. An animal could become frightened. A careless movement could cause injury. Yet knowing these things did not always mean that a person could avoid them. Sometimes work simply had to continue. The fields were not sentimental. The harvest would not wait forever. This is why ancient agricultural labor could be both peaceful and demanding. The same repetitive movements that might look almost meditative to someone watching could leave the worker exhausted. The sound of a tool entering the earth could become familiar. The movement of the arms could become automatic. The rhythm of walking through a field could calm the mind. But after hours beneath the sun, the body still felt the cost. Artavardiya understood this. So did Madukst. Her work was different, but no less important. The household depended upon her ability to keep things functioning. Food had to be prepared. Grain had to be processed. Children needed care. Clothing needed attention. Supplies had to be watched. Animals needed care. The home needed maintenance. Much of this work was repetitive. And because it happened inside the household, it was easy for outsiders to overlook. Yet if Madukst stopped working for several days, the effects would be felt immediately. There would be less food preparation, less cleaning, less organization, more pressure on everyone else. This is why poverty often required a whole family to contribute. It was not simply the story of one man working in a field. It was the story of a household working together. Even children could become important to this system. As they grew older, they learned more responsibilities. An older child might help watch animals. Another might gather fuel. Another might assist with younger siblings. A child might accompany a parent to the fields and learn by watching. These tasks were part of preparation for adulthood. The child was learning the skills that would eventually support another household. There was no sharp division between education and work. Work itself was often education. A child learned by doing. At first, perhaps carrying something small. Then something heavier. At first, watching. Then helping. Eventually, working independently. The process was gradual, and there could be pride in becoming useful. A child who could complete a task without assistance had learned something important. They had become another pair of hands, another source of strength, another person capable of helping the family. But poverty also meant that childhood could be more closely connected to responsibility. There was less room for complete dependence. Every household needed to make use of whatever labor was available. And still, within that world, children remained children. They played. They argued. They laughed. They became curious. They became attached to animals. They listened to stories. They imagined the future. Poverty did not erase childhood. It simply shaped it. The same was true of old age. An elderly person might no longer be capable of the hardest physical work. But that did not mean they became useless. They possessed something else. Knowledge. Memory. Experience. They could teach children. Advise younger workers. Remember family traditions. Know which plants were useful. Know how to make or repair certain things. Remember past harvests. Remember when the river had flooded. Remember years when the rains had failed. In a society dependent upon practical knowledge, memory could be valuable. An elderly person might know things that no young worker had yet learned. So the household's wealth was not only measured in material possessions. It could also be found in knowledge, skills, relationships, reputation, and health. This was especially important for poor families because they had fewer material reserves. If you owned little, you had to make better use of what you did have. That included your body. Artavardiya sat near the fire. His children were now asleep. He looked at them. Perhaps he wondered what their future would be. Would they work the same fields? Would they marry? Would they have their own homes? Would the next harvest be better? Would they have more than he had? These were questions that could not be answered. The future was hidden. But one thing was certain. The children were learning. They were watching. They were absorbing the rhythms of household life. The older child knew that mornings meant work. The younger child would eventually learn the same. And the knowledge would pass forward. This was how ordinary communities survived generation after generation. Not through grand institutions alone, but through families teaching families. The Persian Empire was enormous. Its rulers changed. Its borders shifted. Its armies moved. Its administrators recorded information. Royal projects rose from the ground. But ordinary life continued because ordinary people kept doing ordinary work. Farmers cultivated fields. Herders tended animals. Craft workers shaped materials. Women maintained households. Children learned. Older people remembered. The empire could exist because millions of small tasks were completed every day. And the poorer people who performed many of those tasks rarely received recognition for them. Their names were not always preserved. Their faces were not painted in royal halls. Their personal stories were not carved into monuments. Yet their work mattered. Without them, there would be less food, less cloth, less construction, less agricultural production, less functioning of everyday communities. This makes the lives of poor people worth looking at carefully. Not because poverty was romantic. It was not. It could be exhausting. It could be frightening. It could leave families vulnerable. But poor people were not simply helpless victims waiting for history to happen around them. They made decisions. They developed skills. They formed relationships. They adapted. They solved problems. They found ways to survive. They understood their environment. They knew how to use what they had. And sometimes they found small moments of comfort. A warm meal. A cool evening. A child's laughter. A successful harvest. A repaired tool. A healthy animal. A neighbor's kindness. A festival. A wedding. A story told beside the fire. These things could matter enormously. Artavardia finally stood. The fire had become very low. He prepared to sleep. Outside, the village was almost silent. The day's labor had disappeared into darkness. Tomorrow would bring more. But for now, his body could rest. He lay down beside his family. The house was quiet. The children breathed softly. Madux settled beside them. The night air moved gently through the village. And for a few hours, the body that had worked so hard could finally become still. The fields could wait. The tools could wait. When your body was your wealth. The evening had settled gently over the village. The day's heat was beginning to disappear from the earth, and the coolness of night was slowly returning. Inside the small house, the family had finished eating. There had not been much food, but there had been enough. For a little while, nobody needed to think about tomorrow. The children were becoming sleepy. Madux was tidying the cooking area. Artavardia sat quietly near the fading warmth of the fire. His body was tired. His shoulders ached from the day's labor. His hands were rough. His feet were sore. He had worked for many hours, and yet none of this seemed unusual. This was simply what his body was expected to do. For a poor person in the ancient world, the body could be one of the most important possessions they had. A wealthy household could possess land, animals, precious objects, servants, stored food, and silver. A poor laborer might possess very little of these things. But they still possessed their ability to work, their strength, their experience, their hands, their endurance, their health. In a world without modern machines, this mattered enormously. If a person could work, they could contribute. If they could contribute, the household had a better chance of producing food and maintaining itself. But if the body failed, even temporarily, the consequences could be serious. This was one of the quiet dangers of poverty. A rich person could sometimes survive an interruption. A poor person might have almost no cushion. Imagine waking one morning with a fever. You feel weak. Your head aches. Your body wants to remain beneath the blanket. But the animals still need feeding. The household still needs food. The field still needs attention. There may be no comfortable option to simply stop working for several days. Of course, people did become sick. They rested when they could. Families cared for one another. Traditional knowledge about plants, food, hygiene, and healing existed. Specialists and physicians also existed in the ancient world. But medical care was not modern medicine. There were no antibiotics. No modern hospitals. No reliable treatment for every infection. And even where healing knowledge was sophisticated, poor families did not necessarily have equal access to every resource. So illness could be frightening. An ordinary injury could become more serious. A wound could interfere with work. A painful joint could make farming difficult. A serious illness could prevent someone from earning or producing. And the household would have to adjust. This was why people paid attention to their bodies. A farmer knew his own strength. He knew when the heat was becoming dangerous. He knew when he could continue and when he needed to pause. He understood that exhaustion could lead to mistakes. A tired person could damage a tool. An exhausted worker could fall. An animal could become frightened. A careless movement could cause injury. Yet knowing these things did not always mean that a person could avoid them. Sometimes work simply had to continue. The fields were not sentimental. The harvest would not wait forever. This is why ancient agricultural labor could be both peaceful and demanding. The same repetitive movements that might look almost meditative to someone watching could leave the worker exhausted. The sound of a tool entering the earth could become familiar. The movement of the arms could become automatic. The rhythm of walking through a field could calm the mind. But after hours beneath the sun, the body still felt the cost. Artavardiya understood this. So did Madukst. Her work was different, but no less important. The household depended upon her ability to keep things functioning. Food had to be prepared. Grain had to be processed. Children needed care. Clothing needed attention. Supplies had to be watched. Animals needed care. The home needed maintenance. Much of this work was repetitive. And because it happened inside the household, it was easy for outsiders to overlook. Yet if Madukst stopped working for several days, the effects would be felt immediately. There would be less food preparation, less cleaning, less organization, more pressure on everyone else. This is why poverty often required a whole family to contribute. It was not simply the story of one man working in a field. It was the story of a household working together. Even children could become important to this system. As they grew older, they learned more responsibilities. An older child might help watch animals. Another might gather fuel. Another might assist with younger siblings. A child might accompany a parent to the fields and learn by watching. These tasks were part of preparation for adulthood. The child was learning the skills that would eventually support another household. There was no sharp division between education and work. Work itself was often education. A child learned by doing. At first, perhaps carrying something small. Then something heavier. At first, watching. Then helping. Eventually, working independently. The process was gradual. And there could be pride in becoming useful. A child who could complete a task without assistance had learned something important. They had become another pair of hands. Another source of strength. Another person capable of helping the family. But poverty also meant that childhood could be more closely connected to responsibility. There was less room for complete dependence. Every household needed to make use of whatever labor was available. And still, within that world, children remained children. They played. They argued. They laughed. They became curious. They became attached to animals. They listened to stories. They imagined the future. Poverty did not erase childhood. It simply shaped it. The same was true of old age. An elderly person might no longer be capable of the hardest physical work. But that did not mean they became useless. They possessed something else. Knowledge. Memory. Experience. They could teach children. Advise younger workers. Remember family traditions. Know which plants were useful. Know how to make or repair certain things. Remember past harvests. Remember when the river had flooded. Remember years when the rains had failed. In a society dependent upon practical knowledge, memory could be valuable. An elderly person might know things that no young worker had yet learned. So the household's wealth was not only measured in material possessions. It could also be found in knowledge, skills, relationships, reputation, and health. This was especially important for poor families because they had fewer material reserves. If you owned little, you had to make better use of what you did have. That included your body. Artavardiya sat near the fire. His children were now asleep. He looked at them. Perhaps he wondered what their future would be. Would they work the same fields? Would they marry? Would they have their own homes? Would the next harvest be better? Would they have more than he had? These were questions that could not be answered. The future was hidden. But one thing was certain. The children were learning. They were watching. They were absorbing the rhythms of household life. The older child knew that mornings meant work. The younger child would eventually learn the same. And the knowledge would pass forward. This was how ordinary communities survived generation after generation. Not through grand institutions alone, but through families teaching families. The Persian Empire was enormous. Its rulers changed. Its borders shifted. Its armies moved. Its administrators recorded information. Royal projects rose from the ground. But ordinary life continued because ordinary people kept doing ordinary work. Farmers cultivated fields. Herders tended animals. Craft workers shaped materials. Women maintained households. Children learned. Older people remembered. The empire could exist because millions of small tasks were completed every day. And the poorer people who performed many of those tasks rarely received recognition for them. Their names were not always preserved. Their faces were not painted in royal halls. Their personal stories were not carved into monuments. Yet their work mattered. Without them, there would be less food, less cloth, less construction, less agricultural production, less functioning of everyday communities. This makes the lives of poor people worth looking at carefully. Not because poverty was romantic. It was not. It could be exhausting. It could be frightening. It could leave families vulnerable. But poor people were not simply helpless victims waiting for history to happen around them. They made decisions. They developed skills. They formed relationships. They adapted. They solved problems. They found ways to survive. They understood their environment. They knew how to use what they had. And sometimes they found small moments of comfort. A warm meal. A cool evening. A child's laughter. A successful harvest. A repaired tool. A healthy animal. A neighbor's kindness. A festival. A wedding. A story told beside the fire. These things could matter enormously. Artavardiya finally stood. The fire had become very low. He prepared to sleep. Outside, the village was almost silent. The day's labor had disappeared into darkness. Tomorrow would bring more. But for now, his body could rest. He lay down beside his family. The house was quiet. The children breathed softly. Madaks settled beside them. The night air moved gently through the village. And for a few hours, the body that had worked so hard could finally become still. The fields could wait. The tools could wait. Water, irrigation, and the price of survival. Following the water. Before the sun rose over the village, there was another sound besides the quiet breathing of sleeping families. Water. Not always loud. not always easy to hear. Sometimes it moved gently through an irrigation channel, slipping between the banks and continuing toward fields that depended upon it. For the people who lived there, water was not simply part of the landscape. It was life. A person could survive for some time with very little food. Without water, there was no such comfort. People needed it. Animals needed it. Crops needed it. Households needed it. And in many parts of the Persian world, finding, controlling, storing, and distributing water was one of the most important responsibilities of everyday life. Artavardiya understood this. He had understood it since childhood. The first thing a farmer learned was not always how to plant. Sometimes it was how to read the land. Where was the water? Where did it come from? Where did it disappear? Which fields received it first? Which fields depended upon channels being kept clear? Which places became dry in the summer? Which places remained fertile? These questions could determine the difference between a productive field and an empty one. The Persian Empire contained many different environments. Some regions had abundant rivers. Others depended more heavily on seasonal rainfall. Some agricultural communities used canals. In parts of the Iranian world, underground water systems known as qanats were developed and used to bring groundwater towards settlements and agricultural areas. These systems were remarkable achievements of engineering. But they were not effortless. Water had to be managed. Channels needed maintenance. Earth could collapse. Sediment could accumulate. Blockages could appear. Someone had to inspect the system. Someone had to repair it. And someone had to make sure that water reached the places where it was needed. For a poor family, this could mean another form of labor. Artavardiya walked toward the fields that morning. The sky was pale. The air was still cool. He followed the familiar path. Beside him, the irrigation channel carried water slowly through the countryside. He stopped for a moment. The water was moving. That was good. It meant the crops had a chance. He looked carefully at the channel. Farmers knew that water could not simply be assumed to arrive. A channel might be blocked. A bank might have weakened. Someone might have disturbed the flow. The water had to be watched. This was not glamorous work. There were no royal ceremonies for clearing mud from a small irrigation channel. No musician played while farmers repaired a damaged bank. But these small acts supported agricultural life. Artavardiya crouched near the edge. He moved some earth away. The work was simple. But it took time. And time was something poor people possessed very little of. The more time spent repairing water systems, the less time available for other work. Yet failing to repair them could cause an even greater problem later. This was the strange arithmetic of farming. Spend time now to prevent a larger loss later. Work today so that tomorrow might be easier. Save seed. Repair tools. Maintain animals. Clear water channels. Store food. Everything depended upon preparation. And still, preparation could not guarantee success. The water might be flowing today. Tomorrow could be different. The weather could change. A drought could arrive. A flood could damage the land. A spring could weaken. A river could change its course. Nature remained larger than the farmer. This was perhaps the most important lesson of agricultural life. A person could work very hard and still remain vulnerable. Artavardiya returned to the field. The soil was warm beneath his feet. He began working. Nearby, other farmers were doing the same. The water moved quietly. The crops responded to it. The village continued. There was something peaceful about the scene. Water, earth, sunlight, human labor. The rhythm was ancient. People had been cultivating the land in this part of the world for thousands of years before the Persian Empire existed. Generations had learned how to live with the environment. They had learned where to build, where to plant, where to dig, where to store, where to avoid. Knowledge accumulated slowly. A father taught a son. A mother taught a daughter. Neighbors shared experience. Farmers watched one another. The landscape itself became a kind of teacher. If a certain area remained green longer, people noticed. If water disappeared quickly, they noticed. If soil cracked, they noticed. If a particular plant grew well, they noticed. Ancient people did not possess modern scientific instruments, but they possessed observation. And observation was essential. Madux knew this too. Her household's relationship with water did not end at the field. Water was needed at home. Cooking required it. Animals required it. Cleaning required it. People required it. And carrying water could become part of the daily routine. A container had to be filled, then carried, then emptied, then filled again. The journey might not be dramatic, but repetition made it tiring. Imagine carrying water every day. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly throughout the seasons. The weight is real. The distance matters. The heat matters. The condition of the path matters. The strength of the person carrying it matters. For wealthy households, servants could perform much of this work. For poor households, family members had to do it. Often women and children carried important parts of the household's water burden. This meant that water shaped the daily schedule. You could not simply decide to sleep late. There were things that needed to be done. You could not ignore the water supply. There was no tap waiting inside the wall. Water had to come from somewhere. And once it arrived, it had to be used carefully. Waste was difficult to justify. A spilled container meant lost effort. A damaged vessel meant another problem. A dry source meant uncertainty. The children learned these lessons early. Water was not something to play with carelessly. It was precious. If a child spilled too much, someone had to carry more. If a container broke, someone had to find another. If the source became distant, the journey became longer. Small problems accumulated. And poverty made small problems matter. A wealthy family might solve a broken vessel quickly. A poor family might need to repair it. A wealthy household might have multiple animals. A poor household might have only a few. A wealthy household might have reserves. A poor household might not. Water was therefore connected to everything. Food, animals, agriculture, health, time, labor, security. And the relationship between water and poverty was especially important because poor people often had fewer alternatives. If the harvest failed, a wealthy family might have stored grain from previous years. A poor family might not. If a water source became unreliable, a wealthy landowner might possess access to other resources. A poor farmer might simply suffer. The difference was not always the water itself. It was the ability to survive when the water became difficult. Artavardiya understood this as he looked across the fields. The crops were growing. For now, he could see the green against the earth. It was a comforting sight. Every plant represented possibility. Food. Seed. A future harvest. A little security. But the farmer knew better than to become completely confident. He had seen seasons change. He had watched the sky remain empty. He had seen plants struggle. He had known years when the harvest was better, and years when it was worse. The land taught patience. It also taught humility. You could not command it. You could only work with it. By midday, the sun was strong. Artavardiya returned to the channel. The water was still flowing. He checked the banks again. Then he returned to his work. The repetitive labor continued. Water moved. People moved. Animals moved. The sun moved across the sky. And slowly, another day passed. In the evening, Madux returned from the water source. The container was heavy. Her arms were tired. But the household had water. That mattered. She placed it carefully inside. The children gathered nearby. One asked for a drink. She poured some. The water was cool. For a moment, nothing else mattered. Not taxes. Not harvests. Not work. Not the distant empire. Only the simple relief of drinking water after a long day. This was one of the quiet truths of ancient life. The things that seem ordinary today could feel precious. Clean water. Fresh bread. A warm home. A healthy child. A working tool. A full storage jar. These were not guaranteed. They had to be maintained. Protected. Earned. And sometimes they had to be shared. Night approached. The irrigation channel continued its slow journey through the darkness. The water did not know the names of kings. It did not know the borders of empires. It simply flowed. For generations, people had followed it. Worked beside it. Built around it. Depended upon it. And in the small village, the family knew that tomorrow they would need it again. So they slept. The fields rested beneath the stars. The channels carried their quiet water. And somewhere beyond the darkness, the great Persian Empire continued its endless movement. But here, at the edge of a small village, survival still depended on something much simpler. Water flowing in the right direction. And people waking early enough to follow it. When the water failed. There were mornings when the water flowed quietly through the channels, and the farmers could begin their work with a little more confidence. And then there were other mornings. Mornings when the channel seemed quieter. Mornings when the earth appeared drier. Mornings when a farmer stood beside the fields and looked toward the horizon, waiting for clouds that did not come. For people whose lives depended upon agriculture, the absence of water could change everything. The fields might still look peaceful. The sky might still be beautiful. The village might still wake in the same way. But beneath that ordinary appearance, worry could begin. Artavardiya knew this feeling. He had experienced it before. A season could begin well enough. The crops could emerge from the earth. The family could feel hopeful. Then the rain could become scarce. The irrigation system might not provide enough. The soil could begin to dry. At first, the difference might be difficult to notice. A few plants looked weaker. The ground felt harder. The water level seemed lower. Nothing had failed completely. Not yet. But farmers watched these small changes carefully. They had to. A person who depended on the land could not afford to ignore the signs. Artavardiya walked slowly along the edge of the field. He looked at the crops. He touched the soil. He checked the irrigation channel. The water was moving, but not as strongly as before. He stood quietly. There was nothing dramatic he could do. He could clear the channel. He could repair its banks. He could make sure that water was not being lost unnecessarily. He could organize the work of the household. He could pray according to his beliefs. He could hope for rain. But he could not command the sky. That was the difficult truth. Human beings could dig channels. They could construct impressive systems. They could move water across difficult landscapes. But ultimately, they remained dependent upon nature. A poor farmer felt that dependence more sharply because there were fewer reserves available. If the crop failed, there might not be enough grain stored at home. If the animals suffered, replacing them could be difficult. If the family needed to buy food, they needed something to exchange for it. And if the household had little wealth to begin with, every solution became harder. The family began using water more carefully. Madux watched the household supply. Nothing was wasted. The children were reminded to be careful. Animals were given what they needed. Cooking water was used thoughtfully. The family had always been careful. Now they became even more careful. This is how scarcity often changes daily life. It does not always arrive as a sudden disaster. Sometimes it arrives as a gradual tightening. A little less water. A little less food. A little more work. A little more worry. A little less certainty. The family continued. There was still food. There was still water. The crops had not completely failed. So there was no reason to panic. Yet everyone understood that conditions were becoming difficult. The village spoke about it. Farmers compared what they had seen. Someone had noticed that another channel was weaker. Someone else had heard that a distant settlement was also struggling. A third person believed the weather might change soon. People shared observations. They watched the sky. They watched the land. They watched one another. In an agricultural community, information was valuable. If someone knew that a water source was becoming unreliable, others needed to know. If a channel had been blocked, it needed to be repaired. If rain was approaching, people needed to prepare. If a crop was failing, perhaps another could be planted. Knowledge could sometimes reduce the damage. But it could not remove uncertainty. Days passed. The heat continued. The water became more precious. Artavardia spent additional time maintaining the irrigation channels. This meant more labor. He was already working long days. Now there was another responsibility. He could not simply say that he was too tired. The water had to reach the crops. Every hour spent repairing the system was an investment in the harvest. But the work itself exhausted him. He returned home later. His clothes were dusty. His hands were dirty. His body felt heavy. Madux could see the tiredness in his face. She did not need to ask. She understood. She had spent her own day working with water and household tasks. The children were quieter too. They sensed that the adults were worried. Children often understand more than adults expect. They may not know why everyone is checking the sky. They may not understand why a parent becomes quiet when looking at a storage jar. But they notice. The youngest child asked when the rain would come. Madux did not know. So she gave the gentlest answer she could. Soon, perhaps. And then the child went back to playing. That small exchange carried something important. Hope. Even in difficult circumstances, people continued hoping. They had to. Without hope, everyday work would become almost impossible. The family continued preparing food. They continued tending the animals. They continued repairing the house. They continued caring for one another. Life did not stop because the water was uncertain. Instead, every task became more deliberate. This was especially true for poor households. Waste became more dangerous. A broken container mattered. A lost animal mattered. A damaged crop mattered. A missed day's labor mattered. A poor family could survive many small difficulties. But when several difficulties arrived together, the burden became heavier. That was when poverty could become truly frightening. A weak harvest combined with illness. A damaged tool combined with debt. A sick animal combined with high food prices. A shortage of water combined with an empty grain store. Problems could overlap. And when they did, the family needed support. Neighbors could help. Relatives could help. Communities could organize labor. People could exchange resources. These relationships were part of survival. A village was not merely a collection of houses. It was a network of people who depended upon one another in different ways. Someone might know how to repair a channel. Another might have an animal that could help with transport. Someone might have extra grain. Someone else might know where water was still available. A household that had little wealth could still possess valuable relationships. That was another kind of security. But even communities had limits. If an entire region faced a serious shortage, there might not be enough surplus to share. Everyone could become vulnerable at once. And so the people waited. They worked. They watched the sky. One evening, Artavardiya stood outside the house. The sunset was quiet. The fields had become dark silhouettes. There was a faint breeze. He looked upward. For a moment, he thought he saw clouds. Only a few. Thin and distant. Perhaps nothing would come from them. Perhaps rain would fall somewhere else. But he watched anyway. There was comfort in watching. The human mind has always searched the sky for signs of change. For a farmer, the sky could feel like a message. A dark cloud could mean relief. A clear sky could mean more waiting. The stars could be beautiful. But the clouds were what mattered. Later that night, the family slept. The air remained dry. The village was quiet. Then, sometime before dawn, a sound came. A soft sound. At first, almost impossible to distinguish. A drop. Then another. Rain. Madux opened her eyes. She listened. Another drop touched the roof. Then another. Artavardiya sat up. The children stirred. For a moment, nobody spoke. They simply listened. The rain grew stronger. It touched the earth. It tapped against the roof. It filled the air with a smell that every farmer recognized. Wet soil. The family stepped outside. The village was changing. Rain fell over the houses. It ran along the paths. It darkened the earth. The fields were receiving water. The irrigation channels began carrying more. Artavardiya stood beneath the rain. He smiled. Not because everything was suddenly solved. A single rainfall could not guarantee a successful harvest. But it was something. A chance. A little relief. A reason to hope. Madux lifted her face toward the rain. The children laughed. For a few minutes, the family forgot about empty storage jars. They forgot about tired bodies. They forgot about the long work ahead. They simply stood there. The rain continued, and the ancient Persian countryside seemed to breathe again. The following morning, the fields looked different. The soil was darker. The plants seemed brighter. The air was cooler. The village moved with renewed energy. People checked their fields. They examined the channels. They repaired whatever the rain had damaged. They prepared to continue, because rain could be a blessing. But too much rain could also become a problem. The ancient farmer understood that nature rarely offered simple answers. Too little water was dangerous. Too much could be dangerous too. The goal was balance. Enough to grow, not enough to destroy. And that balance was never completely under human control. Atavardiya returned to work. His body was still tired. His tools were still simple. His family was still poor. The storage jar was still not full. But there was water in the fields. For now. And sometimes, survival was built from these small moments. A repaired channel. A healthy animal. A little grain. A useful tool. A neighbor's help. A few drops of rain. Nothing looked impressive. Taxes, rations, and the Persian Empire. Living under a vast empire. Far beyond the small village where Atavardiya and Madux lived, the Persian Empire stretched across an enormous landscape. There were mountains and plains, river valleys and dry plateaus, busy cities and quiet farming settlements. Caravan routes crossed distant lands, connecting communities that might have been separated by many days or even weeks of travel. At the center of this vast world stood the Persian king and his administration. But for ordinary people, the empire was rarely experienced as a map. It was experienced through smaller things. A road. An official. A messenger. A market. A record. A payment. A required contribution. A harvest. And sometimes a portion of what had been produced by their own hands. For Atavardiya, the empire was distant. He would never stand in a royal palace and discuss the affairs of kings. He did not need to. The decisions made far away could still eventually reach his village. That was one of the remarkable things about an ancient empire. Its size did not prevent it from touching ordinary lives. The Persian rulers maintained systems of administration across their territories, using officials, local authorities, records, and networks of communication. Different regions had different customs and systems. The empire was not one perfectly uniform machine. It was a collection of many peoples and lands brought under Persian rule. Local traditions continued. Languages varied. Religious practices varied. Economic conditions varied. And the exact burdens placed upon different communities could also differ. Still, the imperial system required resources. Armies needed supplies. Officials needed support. Roads and infrastructure needed maintenance. Royal households needed provisions. Large building projects required labor and materials. The empire had to be fed and organized. And much of that ultimately depended upon production. Grain came from fields. Animals came from herds. Goods came from workshops. Labor came from people. For wealthy families, meeting obligations could be easier. For poor families, giving away part of what they had could feel much more significant. This did not necessarily mean that every poor farmer was constantly crushed beneath taxes. History was more complicated than that. But obligations mattered. A household living close to the edge had to think carefully about what it could spare. Artavardiya knew this. After the harvest, the family would not simply look at the grain and think, "This belongs entirely to us." There were many things to consider. Food for the family. Seed for the next season. Animals. Household needs. Possible debts. Exchange. And whatever obligations applied to their community or circumstances. The calculation was never completely simple. Imagine a household with a modest harvest. The grain has been gathered. The family is tired. The children are hungry. The storage jars are being filled. For a brief moment, the family feels relief. Then the calculations begin. How much can be kept? How much must be used? How much must be reserved? What does the household owe? The question is not simply how much grain exists. The question is how much remains after everything else has been considered. This is where poverty becomes especially difficult. If you possess a great surplus, giving away a portion still leaves you with plenty. If you possess only a little surplus, the same proportion can feel much heavier. A wealthy landowner could absorb losses. A poor farmer had fewer choices. And so Artavardiya paid attention whenever matters involving officials or obligations arose. He listened carefully. He asked questions when necessary. He spoke with other villagers. People shared information. What had been requested? When was it due? Who was responsible? What could be paid in grain? What might be paid in another form? Ancient economies did not operate exactly like modern economies. People could exchange goods, labor, and services. Grain could be measured. Animals could be valued. Workers could receive rations in some contexts. Administrative records could keep track of supplies and distributions. In the Persepolis fortification archives, for example, thousands of administrative tablets preserve evidence about the movement and distribution of food and other resources within the imperial system. These records give us a glimpse of something that ordinary people would have known very well. Food was not merely eaten. It was counted, measured, moved, stored, distributed, recorded. The empire depended upon organization. And behind those records were human beings. Workers, travelers, animals, storehouses, fields, officials, families. The vast imperial system rested upon countless ordinary activities. Artavardiya would never see most of them. But he was part of the same world. His grain existed within a larger economic landscape. His village existed within a larger administrative landscape. His labor contributed to a society that extended far beyond the horizon. Sometimes, that could be difficult to understand. The empire was so large. The king was so distant. Why should a small village matter? But from the perspective of the administration, small villages mattered precisely because there were so many of them. A single household might produce only a modest amount. A village might produce more. Hundreds of villages could produce enormous quantities. Thousands of communities together could support armies, cities, officials, and royal centers. Large empires were built not only by kings. They were sustained by ordinary production. That meant poor people were important. Even when they were not powerful. Even when they possessed little land. Even when their names disappeared from history. Their work had value. The grain they produced had value. The animals they raised had value. The cloth they made had value. Their labor had value. And because these things had value, systems existed to organize and collect them. For Artavardiya, this could create a quiet tension. He understood that the empire provided order. Roads allowed travelers and merchants to move. Officials could settle disputes. Administrative systems helped organize huge territories. The empire connected distant regions. But every large system required resources. And some of those resources came from people like him. This did not necessarily mean he spent every day thinking about politics. He probably did not. Most of his thoughts were much more immediate. Would the crop grow? Would the children remain healthy? Would the animals survive? Would there be enough grain? Would the roof hold? Could the broken tool be repaired? Could the family get through the next season? These questions were more important than distant politics. Yet the empire could appear in his life at unexpected moments. A messenger arriving in the village. An official asking questions. A record being made. A required contribution. A military movement somewhere nearby. A traveler passing along a road. A merchant bringing unfamiliar goods. The wider world was never completely absent. It simply appeared in fragments. Madukst experienced the empire differently. She might rarely see officials directly, but she understood the importance of household supplies. If grain was needed for an obligation, that grain had to come from somewhere. If food was scarce, she had to stretch what remained. If the family needed to replace something, she had to help find a solution. The administrative world might be written on tablets, but its consequences could be felt in a kitchen. This was another hidden aspect of poverty. The poor often had less freedom to absorb obligations. When you had a surplus, an unexpected demand could be inconvenient. When you had almost nothing beyond what was necessary, the same demand could require difficult choices. Should you reduce food? Sell something? Borrow? Work more? Ask relatives for help? Delay another expense? There was rarely one perfect answer. The family simply had to choose. And choices made under pressure could shape the future. One evening, Artavardiya returned home after speaking with other villagers. Madukst was preparing the evening meal. She looked at him. He sat down quietly. There was a pause. Then they spoke about what had been discussed. They considered the household supplies. They counted. Not aloud at first. Just mentally. The grain. The animals. The next planting. The food required for the coming weeks. Everything was connected. The children were nearby, listening without fully understanding. For them, the discussion was simply another quiet adult conversation. But their parents understood what was at stake. They were not powerful. They could not negotiate with the king. They could not change the empire. They could only manage the small world they controlled. And perhaps this was one of the most important skills of poor households throughout history. Managing what little you have. Making decisions with incomplete information. Planning for tomorrow while surviving today. Accepting that some things cannot be controlled. And continuing anyway. The fire burned softly. Outside, the village had grown dark. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A few voices carried through the night. The family finished their meal. There was still food. There was still water. The children were safe. The roof was intact. Tomorrow there would be work. And beyond the village, the great Persian Empire would continue moving through its vast territories. Kings would rule. Officials would record. Merchants would travel. Soldiers would march. Buildings would rise. Women, children, and the hidden work of poverty. The work nobody saw. The village was quiet again. Night had passed beneath a sky filled with stars, and the first light of morning was beginning to appear beyond the hills. Inside the small house, Madukst woke before the others. She remained still for a moment, listening to the quiet breathing of her family. The children were asleep. Artavardia was still resting. The fire from the previous evening had almost completely disappeared. Outside, the air was cool. For a few moments, the house belonged entirely to silence. Then Madukst began another day. There was no ceremony to mark the beginning. No one announced that an important worker had arrived at her duties. She simply stood. And the work began. For women in poorer households, much of the labor that kept a family alive happened quietly. It happened inside houses, beside cooking fires, near storage jars, at water sources, around animals, beside looms and textiles, in fields, along village paths. And because much of it was repetitive and domestic, it could easily disappear from the historical record. A royal inscription might tell us about a king. A monumental relief might show soldiers, officials, or delegations. An administrative tablet might record grain or rations. But the ordinary woman grinding grain before sunrise rarely left such a clear record. Her work was often absorbed into the household itself. And yet without that work, the household could not function. Madukst moved toward the grain. The grain had to be processed. This was one of those tasks that could take considerable time. She worked patiently. The movement was repetitive. Back and forth. Again. And again. The work required strength, but also patience. It was not a task that could be rushed without consequences. Food preparation was one of the foundations of household survival. The grain that eventually became bread or porridge did not begin as a finished meal. Someone had to transform it. That transformation was labor. And in many ancient societies, women carried a large share of household food preparation. This meant that a poor woman could spend a significant portion of her day producing the food that everyone else depended upon. The work did not end when breakfast was ready. There would be another meal later. And another tomorrow. This was the repetition of household labor. It renewed itself every day. A field could be planted once and then tended over time. A wall could be repaired and remain standing. A tool could be fixed and used again. But hunger returned every day. So food preparation returned every day too. Madukst prepared the morning meal. The children began waking. The youngest looked sleepy. The older children moved more quickly. They had already learned the rhythm. Morning. Food. Work. Rest. Work again. Madukst gave them their portions. Then she began thinking about the next task. Water. The household needed it. She prepared a container. Depending on the settlement and its local water supply, the journey might be short or long. But regardless of distance, the work had to be done. She walked along the familiar path. The morning air was still cool. Other women were already moving through the village. Some carried containers. Some walked with children. Some were returning home. There was quiet conversation. A greeting. A smile. Perhaps a brief exchange about the weather. These moments were part of village life. Women did not live only within their individual households. They existed within networks of relatives, neighbors, friends, and other women who shared knowledge and sometimes assistance. this social world mattered. A woman could learn how to prepare food from an older relative. She could learn textile work from another woman. She could learn household remedies. She could learn how to care for animals. She could learn traditions. She could also learn the small practical secrets that made life easier. Where to find a particular plant. How to preserve something. How to repair something. How to recognize when a child was becoming ill. How to stretch a food supply. Knowledge moved through people. And much of that knowledge was never written down. At the water source, Madukst filled the container. Then she lifted it. The weight settled against her body. She began walking home. This simple journey represented time. Time that could have been spent doing something else. But household work was connected. Without water, cooking could not continue. Without cooking, the family could not eat. Without food, the workers could not work. So the journey was necessary. The household's economic life depended on it. Back at the house, the children had begun their own responsibilities. An older child helped with an animal. Another gathered something useful. The youngest stayed nearby. Children were gradually introduced to household work. This was part of growing up. But it also reflected economic necessity. A poor family had fewer people available to do specialized tasks. Everyone eventually became useful. This did not mean children were treated only as laborious. They still had relationships. They played. They listened to stories. They became curious. They laughed. They could be mischievous. They could become frightened. They could form deep attachments to parents and siblings. But the boundaries between childhood and responsibility were often different from those familiar to modern families. As children grew, they learned more. The older ones could carry more, remember more, understand more, help more. A boy might learn agricultural skills from his father. A girl might learn household and textile skills from her mother. But these roles were not necessarily completely rigid in every household or region. Life depended upon circumstance. A poor family could not always afford to follow an ideal division of labor. If there was too much work, everyone helped. If someone was sick, another person took over. If a harvest required more hands, women and children could contribute. The household adjusted. That ability to adjust was essential. Madukst returned to the house. She placed the water carefully. Then she looked around. There was still more work. A garment needed attention. The cooking area needed cleaning. Food needed preparation. An animal needed checking. The children needed watching. And later, there would be another meal. The list never truly ended. This was the hidden exhaustion of household labor. There was no clear finish line. A farmer could eventually leave the field. A builder could eventually put down his tools. A craft worker could eventually close a workshop. But household work could continue as long as people were awake. A child needed something. A pot needed cleaning. A garment needed repairing. A fire needed attention. Food needed preparing. Water needed carrying. The work could stretch into the evening. Then the next morning, it began again. For wealthy households, some of these tasks could be delegated to servants or specialized workers. For poor households, the work remained inside the family. That difference mattered. It meant that poverty could consume not only money and food, but time. And time was difficult to replace. Madukst had very little free time. But there were still moments when she could pause. She might sit beside another woman, She might talk with a neighbor. She might laugh at something one of the children had done. She might enjoy the smell of freshly prepared bread. She might look at a healthy animal and feel relief. These moments mattered. Life was not an endless sequence of misery. People adapted to their circumstances. They found comfort in ordinary things. They built relationships. They created traditions. They celebrated when they could. They found reasons to smile. This is important because poverty should not be imagined as a life without happiness. People can experience hardship and happiness at the same time. A family can have little money and still love one another deeply. A mother can be exhausted and still enjoy watching her child laugh. A farmer can worry about the harvest and still feel proud when the first green shoots appear. A poor household can possess almost no luxury and still have moments of peace. That evening, Madux sat near the doorway. The work of the day was finally slowing. The children were nearby. The youngest was telling a story that made little sense. Madux smiled. Artavardiya had returned from the fields. He was tired. She was tired. Neither had much energy left. But the household was safe. The animals were cared for. There was food for tonight. The water container was full. The children were healthy. For a moment, that was enough. The sun disappeared. The sky turned darker. The first stars appeared. Madux looked upward. She had spent another day working. Tomorrow would be much the same. There would be grain, water, food, children, clothing, animals, work, and perhaps a little rest. Her labor would probably never be celebrated in a palace. No monument would carry her name. No royal inscription would describe the morning she carried water. But her work mattered. It held the household together. And in a poor family, holding everything together could be one of the most demanding tasks of all. The village became quiet. Madux prepared the family for sleep. The fire was lowered. The children settled beneath their coverings. Artavardiya lay down. And finally, after a day filled with work that had seemed endless, Madux rested too. For a few hours, there would be nothing to grind. Nothing to carry. Nothing to cook. Nothing to repair. Only darkness. Only silence. Growing up without much. Morning came softly. The darkness outside the little house slowly became grey and then pale gold. Inside, the family began to stir. For Artavardiya and Madux, another day of work was beginning. But for their children, the day was also a lesson. A lesson in how to live. How to carry. How to watch. How to remember. How to help. In a poor household in ancient Persia, children grew into useful members of the family gradually. There was no single age at which a child suddenly became an adult. Instead, responsibility increased little by little. A young child might simply stay close to the adults. They might watch what their parents did. They might imitate them. They might carry something small. They might help gather things. They might be told to stay near younger siblings. As they became older, expectations increased. The family needed their hands. And this was one of the realities of poverty. A wealthy household could afford to allow children to spend more of their time learning, playing, or receiving formal instruction. A poor household had fewer spare hands. Every person who could safely contribute might eventually become important. This did not mean that poor Persian children lived without happiness. They still played. They still laughed. They still invented games. They still became fascinated by animals, stories, strangers, festivals, and everything else that made the world seem large. But their world was closely connected to the needs of the household. The older child watched his father prepare the tools. He had seen the process many times. Today, he was allowed to help. Artavardiya handed him a simple task. The boy watched carefully. His father did not need to explain every detail. The child had already been observing for years. He copied the movement. Slowly. Carefully. His first attempts were imperfect. Artavardiya corrected him. Then he let him try again. This was how practical knowledge moved between generations. Not through long explanations. Through observation. Practice. Correction. Repetition. The boy would remember. One day, he might teach the same skill to his own child. And so knowledge could continue for generations. Madukst was doing something similar inside the house. Her daughter watched her prepare food. The girl had already learned some basic tasks. She knew where certain household things were kept. She knew which containers needed care. She knew that food should not be wasted. She knew that water was valuable. She knew that clothing could often be repaired rather than thrown away. These lessons might seem small, but they were part of surviving with limited resources. A poor household had to make things last. A garment was not simply a garment. It represented material, time, labor, skill. Perhaps someone had spun the fiber. Someone had woven it. Someone had sewn it. Someone had worn it. So when the garment became damaged, the natural response was often repair. The same principle applied to household objects. A broken container might be fixed. A worn tool might be repaired. A piece of cloth might be reused. A useful object could have a long life. This was not necessarily because ancient people were thinking about environmental conservation in the modern sense. They simply understood scarcity. If you did not have much, you learned to use what you had. This was especially true for the poor. The daughter watched her mother work. She listened. She asked questions. Sometimes she became distracted. Madukst smiled and gently brought her attention back. There would be plenty of time to learn. There was no need to know everything in one morning. Growing up was gradual. The same was true for boys. The boy followed his father toward the fields. The morning was cool. The landscape was peaceful. Birds moved across the sky. The earth was still damp from earlier rain. For a moment, the child seemed more interested in the birds than the work. Artavardiya understood. He had once been that age too. He allowed the boy to stop. Then they continued. This was one of the quiet contradictions of childhood in a poor household. Children were expected to become useful, but they were still discovering the world. The two things existed together. A child could be carrying something in the morning and playing with friends later. A girl could help prepare food and then spend an hour laughing with other children. Life was not divided neatly into work and play. The boundaries were flexible. And perhaps this made village childhood feel more communal. Children knew one another. They moved through familiar spaces. They watched adults. They learned which houses belonged to relatives. They knew where animals were kept. They knew which paths led to fields. They understood the landscape around them. The village itself was part of their education. But there was another side to growing up poor. The future could be uncertain. A child did not know what kind of adult life awaited them. Perhaps they would inherit or work on family land. Perhaps they would become a craft worker. Perhaps they would serve another household. Perhaps they would marry and move elsewhere. Perhaps circumstances would change their path completely. The Persian Empire was enormous, and people lived in many different conditions. There was no single experience of poverty. A poor farmer in one region might live differently from a poor craft worker in another. A rural family might depend on agriculture. A city household might depend on skilled labor, trade, or service. Some people were attached to estates or institutions. Others may have had greater independence. The details varied. But for children growing up with limited resources, one thing remained important. They had to acquire useful skills. Skills were a form of security. A child who knew how to work a field had something valuable. A child who could weave or spin had something valuable. A child who understood animals had something valuable. A child who could make or repair objects had something valuable. Practical knowledge could travel with a person. It could not easily be taken away. This made learning important. Not necessarily learning from books. Learning from life. The boy gradually became better at working with his father. He learned the rhythm of the field. He learned when to move, when to stop, how to handle the tool, how to avoid damaging it, how to notice changes in the soil. He was still young, but the process had begun. Inside the house, the girl was learning from her mother. She learned how to prepare food, how to organize supplies, how to care for younger children, how to maintain clothing, how to understand household needs. And perhaps, as she grew older, she would learn additional skills. Textile production could be particularly important in ancient societies. Spinning and weaving required patience. It also required knowledge. Fibers had to be prepared. Thread had to be made. Cloth had to be produced. And garments could take considerable labor. For poor households, producing or repairing textiles themselves could reduce dependence on purchasing finished goods. Again, the household was using its own labor as a resource. The family possessed little money, so it possessed time and skill. Even when that time was exhausting. Even when the work was repetitive. Even when there were moments when the family wished life could be easier. This was the quiet economy of poverty. When money is scarce, labor becomes more important. When labor is scarce, health becomes more important. When health is uncertain, family becomes more important. Everything connects. One evening, the children gathered outside the house. The day's work had slowed. A few other children were nearby. They began playing. There were no elaborate toys. They did not need them. Children have always been remarkably good at turning ordinary objects into games. A stick could become a horse. A stone could become a marker. A small piece of cloth could become part of an imaginary world. A field could become a kingdom. A path could become a road to somewhere far away. Their imagination cost nothing. And for a poor family, that was a wonderful kind of wealth. The adults watched from a distance. Madux smiled as she saw the children laughing. Artavardiya sat beside her. For a little while, neither spoke. They were tired. But they were content. Their children were safe. They had food. They had a home. They had one another. There were still worries. There always would be. The harvest might fail. Water might become scarce. An animal might become sick. an unexpected obligation might appear. But at this moment, the children were laughing. And that mattered. Poverty did not erase affection. It did not erase pride. It did not erase hope. A parent could look at a child and imagine a better future even when they had very little themselves. Perhaps their son would become skilled. Perhaps their daughter would marry into a stable household. Perhaps the next generation would have more. Hope could survive even where wealth did not. Night slowly arrived. The children returned home. The youngest was already sleepy. Madukst prepared the sleeping area. Artavardia checked the doorway. The house became quiet. One by one, the children settled down. The daughter whispered something to her mother. Madukst smiled. Then she gently told her to sleep. Outside, the village was dark. The stars were bright. Somewhere in the distance, an animal moved through the night. The adults finally rested. Tomorrow, the children would learn something else. Perhaps another task. Another skill. Another responsibility. When things went wrong, illness, injury, and bad luck, the village was peaceful in the early morning. A pale light rested over the roofs, and the air was cool enough that people could begin their work without immediately feeling the heat of the day. The fields were waiting. The animals were waiting. The household was waiting. And, as always, there was work to be done. For a poor family in ancient Persia, an ordinary day could be manageable. A difficult day could be exhausting. But a truly bad day was something else. The greatest danger was not always a single enormous disaster. Sometimes it was something very small. A fever. A broken tool. A sick animal. A twisted ankle. A damaged roof. A failed crop. A lost opportunity to work. Any one of these might be survivable. But when several problems arrived together, a household with very little wealth could suddenly find itself in serious difficulty. This was the fragile side of poverty. Artavardia understood it. He had seen neighbors struggle. He had seen a farmer unable to work because of an injury. He had seen animals become sick. He had watched families worry when a harvest was smaller than expected. People helped when they could. But nobody possessed unlimited resources. Everyone had their own household to protect. That morning, Artavardia walked toward the fields with his son. The boy was becoming stronger. He could now perform simple tasks without being watched every moment. His father was proud of him. But Artavardia also understood something else. A young body was not invulnerable. Neither was an older one. Neither was his own. He remembered the aches in his shoulders after long days. Sometimes his back hurt. Sometimes his hands were stiff. Sometimes he woke before sunrise and wished he could remain lying down. But he continued. Work was necessary. There were few alternatives. The fields did not care whether a person felt tired. The animals did not understand exhaustion. The household still needed food. So people learned to distinguish between discomfort and true illness. A sore muscle could be endured. A serious fever could not always be ignored. An injury needed attention. The problem was knowing when something was serious. Ancient people possessed medical knowledge. They were not without understanding. Healers and physicians existed, and people knew various remedies and treatments. Knowledge about plants, food, wounds, bathing, and other aspects of health had accumulated over generations. Some treatments could be useful. Others may have been ineffective or even harmful by modern standards. But the important point was that people did try to understand illness. They observed symptoms. They remembered what had helped before. They sought assistance from people with experience. They prayed. They rested when possible. They cared for one another. Yet there was a great difference between having medical knowledge somewhere in society and having easy access to effective medical care. A poor farmer did not possess the same options as a wealthy official. A wealthy household might be able to obtain better food during illness. It might have servants to perform work while the sick person rested. It might have greater access to specialists. A poor household had fewer choices. If Artavardiya became sick, who would work the field? His son was too young to replace him completely. Madukst already had her own responsibilities. The harvest could not simply pause. This was why illness could affect an entire family. One person's weakness could become everyone's problem. Imagine Artavardiya waking one morning unable to stand comfortably. His body burns with fever. He feels weak. He wants to rest. But outside, the animals need attention. The crops need care. The household needs food. There is no employer waiting to grant paid sick leave. There is no modern hospital nearby. There is no guaranteed income arriving while he recovers. There is simply the family. And the family has to decide what to do. Perhaps Madukst takes over one of his tasks. Perhaps the children help with smaller responsibilities. Perhaps a neighbor offers assistance. Perhaps the work is delayed. Perhaps something is neglected. Every solution has a cost. This was why community mattered so much. A poor family could survive difficult moments partly because people were not always alone. Neighbors knew one another. Relatives lived nearby. People could exchange labor. One person might help harvest another's field. Another might provide food. Someone might lend a tool. Someone might care for an animal. These relationships could become a form of protection. Not the same protection provided by money. Something different. Mutual dependence. The understanding that today you might help someone else, and tomorrow they might help you. But even this had limits. If everyone was suffering, there was less assistance available. And so people valued their health. They valued healthy animals. They valued working tools. They valued stable harvests. They valued anything that reduced uncertainty. A poor household could not eliminate risk. It could only try to manage it. Later that morning, Artavardiya noticed that one of the family's animals was behaving strangely. It was quieter than usual. It did not seem interested in food. He approached carefully. The animal moved slowly. Artavardiya frowned. An animal was not simply an animal. For a poor family, livestock could represent food, transport, labor, breeding, or future wealth. Losing one could hurt. If the animal helped with agricultural work, replacing it might be expensive. If it produced something useful, that production would be lost. If it was part of the household's future plans, those plans might have to change. So Artavardiya watched carefully. He brought water. He checked the animal. He spoke with another villager who had more experience with livestock. Perhaps it would recover. Perhaps it would not. Once again, there was uncertainty. This was one of the hardest parts of poverty. You could make careful decisions and still not know the result. You could work hard and still lose a harvest. You could care for an animal and still lose it. You could protect your family and still face illness. There was no guarantee. That uncertainty could weigh heavily on the mind. Yet people still continued. They had to. Madukst was facing her own concerns. One of the children had begun coughing. It was not necessarily serious. Children became ill. Sometimes they recovered quickly. But every parent knew that illness could become frightening. Madukst watched closely. She made sure the child rested. She provided water. She kept the child comfortable. She paid attention to whether the symptoms changed. The other children were told to be careful. The household became quieter. Work continued around the sick child. That was another difficulty. There was no separate room designed specifically for recovery. The house was small. People lived close together. When one person became sick, everyone noticed. And when the household was poor, there might not be much space to separate people even if they wanted to. Still, Madukst did what she could. She knew her child. She recognized the child's normal behavior. She knew when the child was simply tired. She knew when something felt different. Parents in every age have learned to read these small signs. The evening arrived. The child seemed a little better. The coughing had eased. Madukst finally allowed herself to relax. She sat beside the fire. Artavardiya returned from the fields. He was tired. But he brought good news. The animal seemed to be improving too. Nothing was certain. But there was reason to hope. The family ate quietly. The meal was simple. Yet tonight, it tasted better. Perhaps because they had worried. Perhaps because they were relieved. Perhaps because ordinary food becomes especially comforting after a difficult day. The children settled down. The sick child slept. The animal outside was quiet. And Artavardiya looked around the house. He thought about how easily everything could change. A person could be healthy in the morning and sick by evening. A tool could work one day and break the next. A harvest could look promising and then fail. A strong animal could suddenly become weak. Life was uncertain. But uncertainty did not mean that people were powerless. They prepared. They repaired. They saved what they could. They learned. They watched. They helped one another. They hoped. And sometimes, hope was one of the few things a poor household could possess without needing to buy it. Outside, the night deepened. The village became silent. The fields rested beneath the stars. The family lay close together. For tonight, everyone was safe. The child was sleeping peacefully. The animal was recovering. Tomorrow would bring work again. But tomorrow was not here yet. And so Artavardiya closed his eyes. Madukst rested beside him. The house grew quiet. The fire became a soft glow. And in the darkness, the family could finally forget about all the things that might go wrong. For a few precious hours, there was only sleep. Only stillness. Only the gentle knowledge that, despite everything, they had made it through another day. The day you could not work. Morning came quietly. The first light slipped into the house, touching the floor and the simple household objects that had been arranged there the night before. Madukst was already awake. She listened. The child who had been coughing during the previous evening was still sleeping. That was a good sign. The house was quiet. Artavardiya remained still for a moment. Then he tried to sit up. Something was wrong. A sharp pain ran through his leg. He stopped. He waited. Then he tried again. The pain returned. It was not unbearable. But it was enough to make him hesitate. Yesterday, while working in the fields, he had stepped awkwardly on uneven ground. At the time, he had barely noticed. He had continued working. Now the injury had become harder to ignore. He sat quietly. Madux noticed. She looked at him. He told her what had happened. Neither spoke for a moment. They both understood what the problem meant. If Artavardiya could not work, someone else would have to do his tasks. And if he could not work for several days, the burden would become heavier. This was one of the most frightening realities of poverty. Your ability to work could be one of your greatest assets. But that also meant your body could become a point of vulnerability. There was no savings account waiting quietly for emergencies. There was no modern insurance system covering every possibility. There was no guarantee that another person would replace your labor. The household had to adapt immediately. Madux helped Artavardiya stand. He could walk. Slowly. That was something. Perhaps the injury would improve. Perhaps rest would help. But rest itself had a price. He could not spend the day lying down while everything else stopped. So the family began dividing the work differently. Madux took on more. The older child helped with smaller tasks. Artavardiya did whatever he could without making the injury worse. This was not a perfect solution. It was simply the solution available. The morning passed. The family moved more slowly than usual. The field did not receive as much attention. Some tasks were postponed. Others were completed later. The animal needed care. The household needed food. The children needed supervision. Life continued. But there was now an invisible weight over everything. One person was missing from the work. And the remaining people could feel the difference. This is what made poverty fragile. The family had always been working hard. There had been little spare capacity. Everyone was already doing something. When one person became unable to work, there was no large reserve of labor waiting to replace them. The family had to stretch. Madux understood this. She had always worked hard. Now she simply worked harder. She prepared food. She carried water. She cared for the children. She checked the animals. She helped with the field. She looked after her husband. The tasks seemed endless. But she moved through them one at a time. There was no point thinking about all of them at once. One thing. Then another. Then another. That was how ordinary people survived difficult days. They reduced enormous problems into small tasks. Fill the container. Prepare the food. Check the animal. Help the child. Repair the tool. Return to the field. Rest. Begin again. By midday, the heat had become stronger. Madux returned from the field. She was exhausted. Artavardiya was sitting in the shade. His leg was still painful. He looked frustrated. Not because he wanted to complain, but because he hated watching his family work while he could do less. For a working person, inability can be painful in another way. It can affect pride. A person may feel that they are failing their responsibilities. Artavardiya knew that the injury was not his fault. But knowing that did not make the feeling disappear. Madux reassured him. The family would manage. For now. That phrase mattered. For now. They did not need to solve every future problem. They only needed to manage the present one. This was another lesson of life with limited resources. Think in small distances. Today. Tomorrow. The next meal. The next few days. The next harvest. Thinking too far ahead could become frightening. So people focused on what they could actually control. Artavardia rested. Madukst continued. The children helped. And slowly, the day moved forward. Later that afternoon, a neighbor arrived. He had heard about the injury. He did not make a dramatic announcement. He simply came. He offered to help with part of the field. Artavardia thanked him. The neighbor waved away the gratitude. There would be time to return the favor later. Perhaps someday his own household would need assistance. This kind of exchange could be essential in village life. Not charity in the modern institutional sense. Something more personal. Reciprocity. Mutual support. The knowledge that people were not completely alone. The neighbor worked for a while. The field looked better. Artavardia watched from a distance. He felt relief. Perhaps this was what community meant. Not that hardship disappeared. But that hardship could sometimes be shared. The neighbor eventually left. The sun began to descend. The village became cooler. Madukst returned home. She was exhausted. But the day's essential work had been done. Not perfectly. Not easily. But enough. The children were fed. The animal had water. The injured leg had been kept from unnecessary strain. The field had received some attention. And there was still food for the evening. The family ate quietly. Artavardia's leg still hurt. But the pain had not become worse. That was encouraging. After the meal, he spoke with Madukst. They discussed what would happen if he could not work tomorrow. They made a plan. The older child could help more. Madukst could adjust the household schedule. Perhaps the neighbor would help again. Perhaps Artavardia would be able to return to lighter work. They did not know. But they had a plan. And having a plan made the uncertainty feel slightly smaller. Night came. The children fell asleep. The village quieted. Artavardia lay down. His leg was elevated as comfortably as possible. Madukst settled nearby. For a while, neither spoke. Then Artavardia whispered that he was sorry. Madukst told him there was nothing to apologize for. People became sick. People became injured. People grew tired. That was life. The important thing was that they cared for one another. The words were simple. But they carried comfort. Outside, the night was peaceful. A soft breeze moved through the village. The animals were quiet. The stars were bright. And for a few moments, the family's worry seemed far away. This was perhaps the gentlest side of poverty. Not the hardship itself, but the way people could become closer because they had to depend upon one another. A family with little wealth could still possess affection. A village with little surplus could still possess kindness. A neighbor could still give a day's labor. A parent could still sit beside a sick child. A wife could still reassure an injured husband. A child could still make everyone laugh. These things could not fill a storage jar. They could not replace a lost harvest. They could not repair every broken tool. But they made difficult life bearable. The next morning, Artavardia tried to stand. The pain was still there. But it was less severe. He took a few careful steps. Perhaps he would recover. Perhaps the next day would be easier. He did not know. But uncertainty was something ancient people lived with constantly. They could not see the future. They could only prepare as best they could. And so the family continued. One day at a time. One task at a time. One recovery at a time. The injury would eventually heal. The fields would continue. The children would grow. The household would change. There would be other difficulties. There would also be good days. That was the rhythm of life. Not endless suffering. Not endless comfort. But movement between the two. The family had very little. Yet they had learned something valuable. When one person became weak, the others could carry more. When one household struggled, a neighbor might help. When a problem could not be solved today, sometimes all you could do was wait until tomorrow. And sometimes, tomorrow really was better. The sun rose over the fields. The light touched the roofs. The water moved quietly through the channels. Artavardiya stood near the doorway, leaning carefully on his good leg. He looked toward the fields. There was still work waiting. But this time, he did not need to face it alone. Madux stood beside him. The children were nearby. The village was waking. And slowly, gently, another day began,